We're very fortunate tonight to have Professor Naomi Oreskes from UC San Diego. And Naomi is well known as a historian of science, interested in the development of ideas, and of course was made famous by Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth, the movie Inconvenient Truth, where she did an analysis of the literature around climate change and could show that really there was a huge consensus and very little on the other side in terms of credible ideas. Now, Dr. Oreskes started off as a mining geologist and spent 4 years in South Australia looking at the geology of South Australia. She then went to do her PhD at Stanford University, and at that point developed an interest in the way science, knowledge, and so on was being developed. And so she, at the same time, began to write a series of very interesting books looking at things like continental drift and how those ideas developed in the early 1920s, and then, of course, revisiting them later when there was controversy around those ideas. Also looking at the role of women in the development of science and observing the idea that actually a lot of the engine of science was being done by women, but of course not as much of the proper credit was going to women. So a very interesting sort of career that's developed. Now, tonight she's talking about a new book which she's published with Eric Conway, which is looking even deeper into some of the forces that shape ideas from all the way from tobacco to climate change, and a very interesting tale of perhaps an influence of some shadowy forces, which I will not destroy your thunder. We had some long conversations today, but some of the shadowy forces behind the confusion over very important ideas like climate change. So I should say that Professor Oreskes had a number of distinguished positions at places like Harvard, New Hampshire, New York University, and she's at the moment the Professor of History and Science at UC San Diego. So without further ado, I'd like to invite her to the stage to talk about the Merchants of Doubt. Thank you.
So in 2005, my Austrian governor, Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger, announced an initiative to commit the state of California to Kyoto-level emissions controls of greenhouse gases. And when he made this announcement, he said, "I say the debate is over. We know the science, we see the threat, and the time for action is now." Now, it's not every day you get to agree with a politician, but I thought that my Austrian governor was in fact correct. And indeed, in the mid-2000s, it seemed that the American people had finally gotten the scientific message that global warming was real and underway. The Yale Project on Climate Change, working with the Gallup polling organization in 2007, showed that 72% of American citizens were completely or mostly convinced that global warming was happening. Indeed, they went further. 62% of Americans believed that life on Earth would continue without major disruptions only if society takes immediate and drastic action to reduce global warming. Now, this time period in the mid-2000s was interesting and important because at that time, many former contrarians and skeptics had come around. One of these was the Republican strategist Frank Luntz. And Frank Luntz in 2006 said, "It's now 2006. So he was off to a good start. He got the year right. I think most people would conclude that there is global warming taking place and that the behavior of humans are affecting the climate. Well, still struggling with syntax. Now, Luntz was important, famous, some might say infamous, because he was the author of a memo written to Republican candidates running for elected office in the United States that was leaked to the press. This memo addressed the issue that opinion polls showed that the American people do care about the environment, and the American people did want the government to take steps to protect the environment, but Republicans were perceived as being weaker on that issue than Democrats. And so in order to address this weakness, Luntz gave the candidates a variety of pieces of advice. And among the advice was the advice to use the phrase climate change rather than global warming, because he wrote, "Climate change is a lot less frightening than global warming. He also advised candidates to emphasize scientific uncertainty and to insist that there was no consensus. So he wrote, "The scientific debate remains open. Voters believe that there is no consensus about global warming within the scientific community. Should the public come to believe that the scientific issues are settled, their views about global warming will change accordingly. Therefore, you need to continue to make the lack of scientific certainty a primary issue in the debate." So we see here in this memo the idea of scientific uncertainty being used as a political strategy. Now, Luntz's position about the scientific consensus was not factually correct. Indeed, the scientific debate was not still open. In 2001, in the third assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, climate scientists had concluded human activities are modifying the concentration of atmospheric constituents that absorb or scatter radiant energy. Most of the observed warming over the last 50 years is likely to have been due to the increase in greenhouse gas concentrations. So that was 2 years before Luntz's memo. In fact, however, the scientific evidence had actually coalesced even earlier. In the second assessment report of the IPCC, scientists had concluded that the balance of evidence suggests a discernible human impact on global climate. And my own research on the history of climate science, where I analyzed the public scientific literature related to the issue of anthropogenic global change, showed that scientists indeed had had a consensus on the human-caused climate change by the early 1990s. So it's that consensus that's already in place by 92, 93, that is reflected in the published second assessment report of the IPCC in 1995. Now, when I published this result, it surprised many people. In fact, some people, some skeptics and contrarians said, well, we all know there's a huge debate, so Oreskes must be incompetent if she can't find it. But it really should not have surprised people, because of course, the IPCC report was reflecting a consensus that was part of the reason why world leaders had gathered in Rio de Janeiro in 1992 to sign the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Many Americans have forgotten that the United States is a signatory to the UN Framework Convention, which pledges the nations of the world to preventing dangerous anthropogenic interference in the climate system. And when our first President Bush, George H.W. Bush, signed the Framework Convention, he called on world leaders to translate the written document into concrete action to protect the planet. Now, I've interviewed a number of people who were involved in the politics and the science surrounding the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. One of them was Gus Speth, who served on the Council on Environmental Quality in the Carter White House. And when I asked him about what had happened, he said, yeah, we thought we were on track to make real changes. So what happened? What happened to that scientific consensus that emerged in the early 1990s? And what happened to the political response to that science that was encapsulated in the Framework Convention on Climate Change? So what I want to talk about tonight is to present a brief history of climate science, a very, very brief history of some of the major benchmarks of the development of climate science, and then to tell you the story of the emergence of a political challenge to that science. It's a story of selling uncertainty, as the Luntz memo shows, of using uncertainty as a political tool in order to stave off government action on climate change and to protect the free market, as some people understood it. So most historians would say that the history of modern climate science could start with this man, John Tyndall, who first established the concept of a greenhouse gas. In a series of experiments in the 1850s, so more than 150 years ago, Tyndall showed that certain gases, particularly carbon dioxide and water vapor, have a very distinctive and important property, which is that they are highly transparent to visible light, but rather opaque to infrared. So light from the sun comes into the atmosphere, but tends to be trapped by the greenhouse gases in our atmosphere. That's the natural greenhouse effect, and Tyndall understood this to be a very important fact about the planet, because without greenhouse gases, the Earth would be as cold as the Moon or Mars and inhospitable for life. Now, in the 1900s, this man, Svante Arrhenius, a Swedish geochemist, realized that when you burn fossil fuels, you release carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. and that if you increase the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, then you might expect the climate to warm up. So he did the first calculations of what the effect of doubling carbon dioxide might be, and calculated that it would warm the Earth between 1.5 and 4.5 degrees Celsius. Now, Arrhenius was Swedish, so he thought global warming would be a good thing. The first person to suggest that it might be a bad thing, and that it also might already be underway, was this man, Guy Stewart Callendar, a British steam engineer. Callendar argued in the 1930s that the available data suggested that carbon dioxide was already increasing and that temperature might be increasing too. And in an article published in 1938 in the Quarterly Journal of the Royal Meteorological Society, he suggested that these effects were perhaps already beginning and that scientists should study it in further detail. Now that was 1938. The next year, war broke out in Europe. Scientists became diverted by other issues. And it wasn't until the 1950s that scientists really returned to this question in a vigorous way. And at that time, a number of scientists did return to the question, including these two men, Roger Revelle and Hans Suess, both professors at the University of California, my home institution. In 1957, they published an article in the oceanography journal Tellus, in which they argued that mankind was performing a great geophysical experiment. And by that they meant that carbon had been stored in rocks over the course of hundreds of millions of years of geological time, and now an enormous amount of this carbon was being rapidly returned to the atmosphere by burning fossil fuels, and that this could be expected to have an impact on the atmosphere, and that scientists should begin to monitor the potential effects. So as part of the International Geophysical Year, Revelle was able to obtain funding for the beginnings of what became the systematic measurement of carbon dioxide in the Earth's atmosphere. And that systematic measurement was undertaken by this man, Charles David Keeling, also a professor at the University of California, and for whom we now have what is known as the Keeling curve. And actually you can see Dave here with various copies of his own Keeling curve. So here's what the Keeling curve looked like by the year 2005. Today we know that pre-industrial carbon dioxide was at about 280 parts per million. Today it's up about 385. And this diagram, what's now known as the Keeling curve, is probably now the most reproduced time series data in the entire history of science. It also earned Dave Keeling the National Medal of Science from President George W. Bush. Well, what did Keeling show? He showed that there's a seasonal variation in carbon dioxide associated with photosynthesis in the northern hemisphere, where most of the world's land masses are. And also, by 1965, he had concluded that there was, in fact, a detectable, steady, slow, but sure increase in total carbon dioxide, so that by 1975, it was already 5 parts per million higher than it was when he first started measuring it in 1958. As a result of this work, in 1965, the United States President's Science Advisory Committee wrote a report on environmental pollution in which they predicted that climate changes would result by the year 2000. And they wrote, by the year 2000, there will be about 25% more carbon dioxide in our atmosphere than at present, and this will modify the heat balance of the atmosphere to such an extent that marked changes in climate could occur. Now, it's often said that politicians never listen to scientists, but at least one did. That same year, this report made it to the desk of President Lyndon Johnson, who in 1965 declared in a special message to Congress, "This generation has altered the composition of the atmosphere on a global scale through a steady increase in carbon dioxide from burning fossil fuels." So we see here, as early as 1965, the emergence of a scientific prediction about something that could happen, and that message making it all the way to the United States White House. Now, this is a complicated story. I don't have time to go into all the details of the science, but an important development at this time is also the development of digital computers and the possibility of building computer models of the Earth's climate system. So with the rise of computer modeling, there soon emerged a strong consensus among scientific experts that given the steady rise of carbon dioxide that Keeling had documented, that sooner or later, global warming, temperature increases would be expected to occur. And that was a conclusion from basic physics and chemistry as worked out in general circulation models of the atmosphere. This consensus was summarized in many different places, but perhaps most clearly by the U.S. National Academy of Sciences in 1979, who wrote, "A plethora of studies from diverse sources indicates a consensus that climate changes will result from man's combustion of fossil fuels and changes in land use." Now, we often hear skeptics and contrarians and denialists today saying that science is not about consensus, science is about the heroic individual who stands up. But actually, here we see scientists themselves saying that science is about consensus and using that word and pointing out that experts are in agreement that there will be changes as a result of this increase in greenhouse gases and changes in land use. Now, it's important to be clear about what the consensus is. This is a consensus about a prediction based on physics and chemistry. That is to say, scientists understand that carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. If you increase the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, then physics and chemistry tells you that warming should occur. So it's a consensus about a prediction. But the big question was when. In 1979, there was a consensus that warming would be expected to occur, but there was not yet a consensus about when it actually would occur. And most scientists at this time thought that will result meant probably by the year 2000, as articulated in that 1965 report, or perhaps later, perhaps 2010, 2030, maybe as late as 2050. Now, a few mavericks, however, suggested that climate change might already be underway. So, for example, in 1981, John Perry, who was the chief staff officer for the U.S. National Academy of Sciences Board on Climate Research, wrote, "Physically, a doubling of carbon dioxide is no magic threshold. If we have good reason to believe that a 100% increase in carbon dioxide will produce significant impacts on climate, then we must have equally good reason to suspect that even the small increase we have already produced may have suddenly altered our climate." So we see scientists recognizing that changes could be underway, but they might be subtle and they might be hard to detect. However, Perry concluded that just because they were hard to detect didn't mean that they weren't happening. And so he concluded, "Thus, climate change is not a matter for the next century. We are probably doing it right now." Well, were we doing it then? Was Perry right? Were changes already happening? Well, in 1982, Roger Revelle addressed the question in Scientific American magazine, and he wrote, "Mathematical models of the world's climate indicate that the answer is probably yes, but an unambiguous climate signal has not yet been detected." So the surprising result for scientists who thought that global warming would not be detected until the year 2000 or the year 2020 or 2050 was 6 years later when a team of climate modelers at the NASA Institute, the Goddard Institute for Space Studies, part of NASA, led by climate modeler Jim Hansen, declared that that signal had in fact been detected, that anthropogenic climate change was underway, and this was in 1988. That summer, he testified in congressional hearings in the United States Senate that he and his team were 99% certain that climate change had in fact become detectable. And it was this emerging consensus and disturbing evidence that climate change might in fact be occurring more rapidly than scientists had originally expected that had led to the creation of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in 1988. We've heard a lot about the IPCC in the last year and a lot of accusations that the IPCC is in some ways problematic, but hardly any journalist ever stopped to ask the question, well, why was the IPCC created in 1988 anyway? What did we already know at that time about climate change? And the answer is we already knew that it was expected to occur, and we already knew that there was evidence that it might, in fact, already be happening. That same summer, the New York Times wrote, "The issue of an overheating world has suddenly moved to the forefront of public concern." So again, we see a kind of momentum emerging, a scientific consensus emerging, press attention, media attention, and, as I've already mentioned, in 1992, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, committing the world to taking action on this issue. But at the same time that the scientific understanding was coalescing, and there was the beginning of the work towards creating the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, so was a politically motivated campaign to cast doubt on the science. The politically motivated campaign focused on the claim that the science was unsettled, that there was not a consensus, and therefore that it would be premature for governments to act to prevent global warming. And as a historian, I'm interested in origins. Historians are always interested in how ideas have developed, where they came from. And it turns out in this case that that claim, that the science was unsettled, that there was no consensus, and that it was too soon to act, can be traced back to a handful of people. In fact, so I'll just say, so today there are attacks on climate change from many quarters. As many of you know, there are attacks on climate change right here in Queensland. But one of the most important, one of the most significant, going back to the 1980s, to this early period when the consensus was first emerging, is the George C. Marshall Institute in Washington, D.C. This is a think tank that for many years has denied the reality of global warming, or insisted that if warming were occurring, it was not caused by human activities, or even if it was, that it might not be that serious and it would be too soon to take action to do anything about it. As recently as 2007, the Marshall Institute quoted Timothy Ball, a Canadian climatologist, arguing that the widely propagated fact that humans are contributing to global warming is the greatest deception in the history of science. Today, the Marshall Institute no longer denies the reality of man-made climate science, but they continue to cast doubt on the science. They continue to insist that the uncertainties are very great, very profound. If you saw me on Late Line last night, there was a clip of someone from the Marshall Institute saying, oh, there are very profound uncertainties. Yes, well, there are many profound things in the world. And they imply through innuendo, suggest that there's something wrong with climate science. So, for example, in March 2010, they said, many of the temperature data and computer models used to predict climate change are uncertain, as are our understandings of important interactions in the natural climate. Reducing these many uncertainties requires a significant shift in the way climate change research is carried out. Well, this is a very interesting statement which reflects how they operate because, of course, the first half of the statement is true. Many of the temperature data and computer models are uncertain. Many important interactions in the natural climate are not entirely understood. This is true of all science. Science, the natural world is complicated. There are always uncertainties in any live science. But the innuendo here is that there's something wrong with climate science and that somehow climate science has to change the way it is carried out. So where did the Marshall Institute come from? And why do they promote doubt about climate science? Why do they allege that climate science is unreliable? Well, the Marshall Institute was founded in 1984 by 3 men. They were all physicists, all distinguished, prominent, reputable physicists who had made their names working in the Cold War on Cold War weapons and rocketry programs. On the left, Robert Jastrow, the man who had the original idea to create the Marshall Institute, who was an astrophysicist who had worked extensively in the space program and was the head of the Goddard Institute for Space Studies. On the right, William Nierenberg, a nuclear physicist who had began his career in the Manhattan Project working on isotope separation, who was the longtime director of the Scripps Institution of Oceanography, where throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s, a great deal of work was done for the U.S. Department of Defense on anti-submarine warfare and acoustic detection of Soviet submarines. And in the center, the founding chairman of the board of the Marshall Institute, Frederick Seitz, also a nuclear physicist who had worked on the hydrogen bomb at the beginning of his career, been a science advisor to NATO, and became the president of the U.S. National Academy of Sciences and president of the Rockefeller University. All distinguished, all influential, all physicists. In the early 1980s, these 3 men found themselves working together on an advisory panel to the Reagan administration on the question of strategic defense, or what most of us know of as Star Wars, the idea of building a missile shield to protect the United States from incoming intercontinental ballistic missiles. In 1984, they created the Marshall Institute to support and defend SDI against a scientist boycott of it. SDI was highly controversial for many reasons, but primarily because it was a departure from the long-established Cold War doctrine of mutual assured destruction. Most scientists said that it was not feasible, that you couldn't really build a missile shield that would really protect you entirely from incoming ballistic missiles. But even if you could, it was a bad idea because it would be destabilizing. Because if one side that is to say the United States, thought that it had an effective missile shield, then it might be tempted to launch a preemptive attack, thinking that it was protected from retaliation. And then the whole concept of mutual assured destruction, which had maintained the peace throughout the Cold War, would be out the window. And as a consequence, 6,500 American scientists and engineers signed a petition declaring a boycott of program funds, that they would not accept funding from the Strategic Defense Initiative to do research on this project. This was historically unprecedented in the entire history of the Cold War. During the Cold War, there were many individual scientists who decided that they personally did not want to work on weapon systems, or maybe particular weapon systems that they did not find morally acceptable, but there had never been a wholesale rejection of a weapons program in this manner. The Reagan administration was extremely disturbed by this, and Jastrow sites and Nuremberg were disturbed too. Against the vast majority of their scientific and technical colleagues, Jastrow sites and Nuremberg argued that SDI was feasible, and moreover, that it was necessary and even urgent. Why was it urgent? Why would Cold War scientists agree to a departure from mutual assured destruction when everyone involved argued that mutual assured destruction was the mechanism for maintaining the peace and was why we had avoided nuclear Armageddon? Well, because they believed that the Soviet Union was overtaking the United States. And from 1984 to 1989, they worked to defend strategic defense by promoting an alarming view of Soviet strength and a frightening view of American weakness. They published articles, opinion pieces, wrote letters to editors, all of them emphasizing that the Soviet Union was pulling ahead and that the United States needed to shore up its defenses in order to protect itself. I don't have time to give you many examples of the sorts of things they wrote and said, but this is my favorite, published in 1987, America has 5 years left. Fortunately, that turned out not to be true. Well, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on your opinion of the Tea Party. No, just kidding. Now, of course, we know in hindsight that this claim was preposterous. 2 years later, the Berlin Wall fell, the Soviet Union began to disintegrate, and we learned that, in fact, the Soviet Union was way behind the United States in many ways technologically, and particularly in terms of its the accuracy and the technological sophistication of its nuclear arsenals. But nevertheless, this was the position that they promoted. Now, at the time, Seitz had retired. All of these men by this point were fairly elderly, and Seitz had retired from his position as president of the Rockefeller University, and he had taken on one last job, and that was working as a consultant to the R.J. Reynolds Corporation. From 1979 to 1985, he directed a biomedical research program for the R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Corporation, whose purpose was to fund research that could cast doubt on the dominant scientific view of the harms of tobacco. Now, we now know from the work of many scholars, as well as through extensive litigation, that one of the major strategies that the tobacco industry used to defend its product was doubt-mongering, to insist that the scientific evidence was unsettled, and to emphasize the uncertainties, to say, well, yes, there is some evidence, but it's highly uncertain. The mechanisms of cancer are not well understood. You could have two sisters who both smoke a pack a day, and one gets cancer and the other doesn't, and we can't explain that. And of course, all of that was true. But it didn't refute the huge body of epidemiological and laboratory and other evidence that tobacco was highly harmful, causing a whole host of diseases, not just lung cancer. But nevertheless, the tobacco companies continued to insist that the science was unsettled, and therefore it would be premature for public health officials or governments to take action against it. Well, this was the strategy that Seitz helped the tobacco industry to continue to promote throughout the 1980s, and this was the strategy then that he brought over to the Marshall Institute. In 1989, these two strands of the story merged. The Berlin Wall fell, the Soviet Union began to break apart, and the Cold War was over. So you might have thought that these old Cold Warriors would have rested content, that they would be happy that their work had helped the West win the Cold War, and that the Soviet Union had not triumphed over the West, had not been able to dictate terms. But instead of resting content, they found a new enemy. And that new enemy was environmentalism, or what they called environmental extremism, what they considered to be the exaggeration of environmental threats by people with a left-wing agenda.